The gym smelled of sweat, leather, and ambition. Every corner echoed with the thuds of gloves hitting pads and the sharp grunts of fighters pushing their limits. In the middle of it all stood Derek, the self-proclaimed star pupil. He had the look, tall, muscular, a black belt tied neatly around his waist, and the kind of swagger that made others step aside when he walked. For him, the dojo wasn't just a place of discipline, it was his stage, and he craved the spotlight. But in the shadows, there was another figure. James, the janitor, moved quietly with a mop and bucket in hand. His uniform was worn, shoes scuffed, and his silence often mistaken for weakness. Most of the fighters hardly noticed him, and when they did, it was usually to crack a joke or toss a careless insult. Derek, in particular, had made James his favorite target. "Hey, janitor," Derek called out one evening, his voice carrying across the dojo. "Careful with that mop. Wouldn't want you to slip and hurt yourself. We can't afford to lose our cleaning staff." His buddies laughed, feeding off his arrogance. James didn't respond. He never did. He kept his head down, his expression unreadable, as if insults bounced off him like rain on stone. But Derek wasn't satisfied with silence. He thrived on reactions, on proving himself dominant in every space he occupied. That day, something different was in the air. Maybe it was the adrenaline of his last sparring win, or maybe it was the need to assert himself as untouchable. Derek looked straight at James and smirked. "Tell you what, janitor, why don't you put down that mop and step into the ring with me? Let's see if you can clean up in here, too." The dojo went quiet. Fighters exchanged glances, unsure if Derek was joking. A challenge like that wasn't just disrespectful, it was humiliating. Sparring wasn't a game, and inviting the janitor, a man who supposedly had no training, was crossing a line. But Derek's arrogance had no boundaries. James paused for a moment, his hands tightening slightly on the mop handle. For the first time in weeks, his eyes met Derek's. Calm, steady, without a trace of fear. He didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He simply placed the mop back into the bucket, straightened his posture, and walked toward the ring. The room buzzed with disbelief. "No way," someone whispered. "He's actually going to do it." Another fighter chuckled nervously. "This is going to be ugly." Derek grinned, thinking he had just won the biggest ego boost of his life. He tied his belt tighter, bouncing lightly on his toes, already picturing himself flooring the janitor in front of everyone. His reputation would skyrocket, and James would be reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale of humiliation. But while Derek basked in the imagined glory, others noticed something different. As James climbed into the ring, there was no hesitation in his movement. His back straightened, shoulders squared. Gone was the slouch of a janitor. In its place stood a man with presence, a quiet intensity that demanded attention. The instructor frowned, sensing the shift. He had seen fighters come and go, but there was something about the way James carried himself that felt familiar. He didn't say a word, though. He simply let the scene play out, knowing sometimes the best lessons came from silence. The crowd circled the ring, phones out, whispers flying. Derek cracked his knuckles and pointed at James. "Don't take it personal, old man. This is just a little fun." James didn't reply. He simply adjusted his stance, feet balanced, hands loose but ready. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but to anyone who had ever fought before, it was the stance of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Derek lunged forward first, confident and careless. He swung a wide punch, more for show than precision. But James didn't flinch. In a single, fluid motion, he sidestepped, letting Derek's fist cut through empty air. The room gasped. No one had expected the janitor to move like that. Derek laughed it off, trying to mask his surprise. "Lucky," he muttered, resetting his stance. But as he came forward again, throwing a sharper combination, James slipped past every strike, calm as a shadow. No wasted energy. No panic. Just precision. The whispers in the dojo grew louder. Some of the younger fighters lowered their phones, too stunned to keep recording. It wasn't just luck. James wasn't surviving. He was in control, and with Each effortless dodge, Derek's confidence began to crack. What started as a joke had shifted into something else entirely. And though no one knew it yet, they were about to witness a revelation that would leave the entire dojo and Derek himself speechless. The dojo was holding its breath. Derek, fists raised and jaw tight, circled James with growing irritation. What was supposed to be a public humiliation had turned into something far more dangerous, a test of his own pride. Derek had never been made to look foolish before, not by another fighter, and certainly not by a janitor. "Stand still, old man," Derek growled, lunging forward again. His punches were sharper this time, his kicks faster, fueled by embarrassment. Each strike cut through the air with precision, but James slipped away like smoke through fingers. A step back here, a pivot there, a subtle shift of weight. He didn't block, he didn't need to. He simply wasn't there when the strikes landed. Spectators were no longer laughing. The whispers had changed into murmurs of disbelief. "How's he doing that?" someone muttered. Another fighter, eyes wide, shook his head. "That's not luck. That's skill. Serious skill." Derek's frustration boiled over. He came in harder, throwing a flurry of punches meant to overwhelm. For a split second, he thought he had James cornered. But James's response was effortless, a slight lean, a turn of the shoulder, and then, with almost surgical precision, he tapped Derek's arm with a palm strike, redirecting the punch and sending Derek stumbling off balance. The crowd gasped. Derek staggered, regaining his footing, but the damage was already done. His cheeks burned red. He was no longer in control. The janitor, the man he mocked, was making him look like an amateur. "Fight me for real," Derek shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. "Stop playing around." James's eyes narrowed slightly, but his face remained calm. He hadn't thrown a single offensive strike yet. He didn't need to. His silence, his composure, was louder than any punch. The instructor folded his arms, his eyes locked on James. He had trained hundreds of fighters, but this was something else. The stance, the footwork, the timing, it was textbook mastery. Whoever James really was, he wasn't just some custodian. He was someone far more dangerous, far more seasoned. Derek charged again, this time with a spinning kick. It was flashy, reckless, the kind of move he used to impress onlookers. But James anticipated it before it even left the ground. In one swift motion, he stepped into the spin, caught Derek's leg midair, and gently pushed him backward, sending him sprawling onto the mat. The dojo erupted. Some clapped their hands to their mouths, others muttered in shock. Derek, the pride of the class, had just been thrown down like a rag doll by a man who hadn't even broken a sweat. For a moment, Derek just lay there, staring up at the ceiling, his chest heaving. Humiliation burned through his veins, hotter than any strike he'd ever taken. He scrambled to his feet, rage clouding his judgment. Again, he barked, fists trembling, "I'm not done." James stood still, calm and unshaken. He didn't raise his fists, didn't taunt, didn't even speak. He simply shifted his weight slightly, ready but unhurried. His silence was a challenge in itself, a mirror reflecting Derek's desperation. The next exchange was brutal. Derek unleashed everything. Hooks, jabs, low kicks, even a desperate knee strike. The dojo filled with the sound of fists cutting through air, shoes squeaking against mats, Derek's heavy breathing echoing off the walls. But James moved with the grace of water, flowing around every strike, his eyes never leaving Derek's. To those watching, it felt unreal, like watching a master toy with an overeager student. And then, finally James struck. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't violent. It was precise. As Derek lunged forward with a sloppy right hook, James shifted just enough to let the punch graze past him. Then, with lightning speed, he delivered a sharp, open-hand strike to Derek's chest, not enough to cause serious harm, but enough to knock the wind out of him. Derek stumbled backward, clutching his chest, gasping for air. The dojo went silent. You could hear the sound of Derek's labored breathing as he bent forward, struggling to recover. James, still calm, simply stepped back, his stance loosening once more. He hadn't followed up. He hadn't tried to finish Derek. He had just proved a point. For the first time, Derek's confidence cracked wide open. His eyes darted around, seeing the looks on his fellow fighters' faces. They weren't laughing anymore. They weren't cheering him on. They were staring at James with awe, with respect, the kind Derek had always craved but never truly earned. One of the younger students whispered, "Who is this guy?" James said nothing. He simply turned, walking toward the edge of the mat, as if it were over. But Derek, pride shattered and desperation consuming him, couldn't let it end that way. With a roar, he charged once more, reckless and wild. It was a mistake. James spun lightly, his movement as smooth as a breeze, and in a single motion, swept Derek's legs from beneath him. Derek hit the mat hard, the sound echoing through the dojo like a final verdict. This time he didn't get up. The silence stretched, heavy, and electric. Every pair of eyes was on James. He stood there, calm and collected, his chest barely rising with a steady breath. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply picked up his mop and bucket from the corner of the dojo, as though nothing had happened, as though he hadn't just dismantled the dojo's best fighter. And in that silence, the truth began to dawn. James wasn't just a janitor. He was something far greater. The dojo had never been so quiet. The only sound was Derek's ragged breathing as he lay on the mat, his chest heaving, his pride shattered into pieces too small to pick up. The man who had strutted into the ring full of arrogance now looked like a child who had wandered into the wrong playground. And standing over him, mop in hand, was James, the janitor no one had ever thought twice about. The fighters exchanged uneasy glances. Some lowered their phones, ashamed for recording what they thought would be an easy humiliation. Others kept staring, eyes wide, as if their entire understanding of strength had just been rewritten. That wasn't normal. One whispered, "No janitor moves like that." Another said, "He didn't even try. He was just playing with Derek." The dojo's instructor, a seasoned martial artist named Master Alvarez, hadn't moved since the sparring began. His arms remained folded, his gaze fixed on James. The movements, the timing, the sheer control, they weren't the techniques of an amateur. They were the signature of mastery. Alvarez knew it, but he couldn't yet place where he had seen it before. Derek, humiliated but unwilling to accept defeat, pushed himself off the mat. His face was red, sweat dripping down his forehead, but his eyes burned with denial. You think you're better than me," he spat, his voice trembling. "You're just a janitor. A nobody. This doesn't mean anything." His words rang hollow. Even he didn't believe them. The image of James effortlessly dodging, redirecting, and dismantling his every attack haunted him like a nightmare. No amount of shouting could erase what everyone had just witnessed. James didn't respond. He simply set the mop back in its bucket and turned his back as though Derek no longer existed. That, more than anything, cut Derek deeper than any punch could have, to be dismissed so completely, to not even be worth a reply. It was unbearable. The whispers grew louder. Where did he learn that? Is he a retired fighter? No way, he's just some janitor. A few of the older students, who had followed professional fighting for years, exchanged knowing glances. Something about James's movements, the efficiency, the calmness under pressure, it stirred a faint memory. Master Alvarez finally stepped forward. His voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "Enough." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to him, waiting for his verdict. He studied James carefully, as if peeling back layers of disguise. "You," Alvarez said slowly, his tone deliberate. "You fought before. Not here, not in some local gym, but at a level these students can't even imagine." James's gaze shifted to him briefly. For the first time, his expression softened, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He gave the faintest of nods, then looked away, as if he had already said too much. The dojo erupted again. "I knew it," one student exclaimed. "He's got to be someone famous." Another leaned forward, eyes wide. "Wait, what if he's that guy?" The one they called, he stopped, not daring to finish the sentence. Derek's head snapped up. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice shrill with desperation. "He's nobody. Just a cleaner, that's all." He pointed at James with shaking hands. Don't fall for this act. He's just lucky. But Derek's protests were drowned out by curiosity. The younger fighters scrolled through their phones, searching for clips, names, anything to match the phantom of skill they had just witnessed. Some of them froze, staring at grainy videos of past MMA tournaments, their eyes widening as they compared the movements on screen to the man standing quietly by the mop bucket. "It's him," one finally whispered. "It has to be." The realization spread like wildfire. A name passed from mouth to mouth, hesitant at first, then growing louder. Silent Storm. Derek's blood ran cold. The name was legendary. Stories of the fighter, who had risen from nothing, who had demolished opponents with a calm ferocity, who had vanished at the peak of his career without explanation. 5-time world champion, undefeated in his prime. Silent Storm, a ghost in the world of mixed martial arts. No, Derek shook his head violently. No, that's impossible. He wouldn't be here, scrubbing floors. He wouldn't be. His voice cracked. Deep down, he knew the truth. The stance, the precision, the control. It was all there. He had just been dismantled by one of the greatest fighters the sport had ever known. James, still silent, finally picked up the mop once more and began to clean the sweat from the mat where Derek had fallen. It was as if none of this mattered to him, as if glory, titles, and recognition were long behind him. To James, he was just doing his job. But to everyone else in the dojo, the janitor they had ignored had transformed into something larger than life. Respect rippled through the room. Where there had once been laughter and dismissal, there was now awe. Master Alvarez watched him with a heavy expression. "So, it's true," he murmured under his breath. Silent Storm, hiding in plain sight, and for the first time, Derek had nothing to say. His arrogance, his insults, his pride, all lay shattered on the same mat where he had been humiliated. And James? He carried on as though nothing had happened, leaving everyone else to wrestle with the truth that they had overlooked a living legend in their midst. The dojo's atmosphere shifted from curiosity to reverence. The whispers of Silent Storm swirled like wind through the room, carrying awe and disbelief in equal measure. For years, fighters had spoken of him as if he were a myth, a ghost who rose from nowhere, conquered everyone, and then vanished without explanation. And now, here he was, mop in hand, wearing the clothes of a janitor. Derek sat slumped against the wall, his body aching but his pride wounded far worse. His mind replayed the last few minutes in humiliating detail, every dodge, every effortless counter, every moment where James made him look like a child flailing against a master. The realization that he had challenged Silent Storm burned him from the inside out. Why? The word slipped out before Derek could stop it. His voice was quieter now, not the arrogant bark it had been before. Why would someone like you end up here, mopping floors? The room fell silent again. Everyone leaned in, waiting, hoping James would finally speak. For a long moment, James didn't answer. He moved the mop slowly across the mat, each stroke deliberate, as though he were gathering his thoughts. Then, finally, he rested the handle against the bucket and straightened his back. His eyes swept across the room, calm but heavy, as though carrying years of unspoken truth. "I fought because I had nothing else," he said at last, his voice low but steady. It was the first time many of the students had ever heard him speak more than a polite word. "I grew up in neighborhoods where violence was the only language anyone respected. Fighting was survival. And when I realized I was good at it, I made it my life." The students hung on every word. Even Derek, despite himself, listened intently. "I rose fast," James continued, his gaze distant, as if replaying memories from another life. "Too fast. They called me Silent Storm because I didn't talk much, didn't celebrate, didn't trash talk. I let my fists speak. 5 championships, undefeated streaks, headlines, fame, you name it, I had it. But fame is a dangerous thing. It convinces you that you're invincible, that you're more than human." He paused, his jaw tightening. For the first time, his voice wavered. Then came the accident. A hush fell over the dojo. Everyone leaned forward. "It was a match I should never have taken," James said. A young fighter, hungry and reckless. He came at me with everything he had, and I didn't hold back. I struck harder than I needed to, trying to prove a point. He went down, and he didn't get back up. He survived, but barely. He never fought again. James closed his eyes briefly, the weight of memory pressing against him. They called it an accident. The officials cleared me. The fans cheered anyway. But inside, I knew I had crossed a line. I had destroyed someone's dream, his future, all for pride. The dojo was silent. Not even the sound of breathing broke the stillness. The students stared at him, their faces a mix of sorrow and respect. I walked away after that. James said softly, I disappeared. I couldn't stomach the cheers anymore, not when I knew what it had cost another man. So I left the sport, left the fame, left everything. I wanted a life where no one looked at me like a hero, where I could just exist. So here I am, a janitor, cleaning up after others, keeping quiet. It's simpler this way, safer. His words cut deep, not because they were dramatic, but because they were honest. Master Alvarez nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. You carried the burden alone, he said, but walking away doesn't erase who you are. Silent Storm isn't just a fighter. He's a man who mastered himself. And today, these students needed to see that. James gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. I'm no teacher, Master. I'm just a man who made mistakes. Maybe, Alvarez replied, but mistakes don't erase wisdom. And what you showed here wasn't just fighting. It was control, patience, humility. These are lessons most fighters never learn. The younger students nodded, their admiration for James growing with each word. Some of them had entered the dojo chasing belts and titles, craving the glory Derek always flaunted. But now, looking at James, they realized there was something far more powerful than medals: integrity. Derek, still sitting on the floor, felt his chest tighten. All the things he had mocked James for, his silence, his humility, his invisibility, were the very things that made him strong. Derek had thought he was invincible because of his black belt, his muscles, his reputation. But in minutes, James had shown him that real strength wasn't loud. It wasn't arrogant. It was quiet, disciplined, and unshakable. The weight of the lesson crushed Derek harder than any strike. For the first time, his arrogance gave way to something unfamiliar, shame. James bent down, picked up his mop again, and began working silently as if the confession had taken everything from him. To him, it was just another night in the dojo. But for everyone else, the janitor they had ignored had just become the greatest teacher they had ever known. And Derek? He couldn't look away. He had mocked a man who had already carried battles heavier than Derek could imagine. The sting of defeat was nothing compared to the sting of realization. He had been living for pride, while James had been living with purpose. The dojo stayed silent long after James's words faded into the stillness. His confession lingered in the air, heavy and unshakable, reshaping how everyone saw him. No longer a janitor, no longer an invisible figure in the background. James was now a man who had carried greatness and walked away from it, a man who had chosen humility over fame. Derek, still sitting on the mat, felt his world collapse in on itself. The fighter who had strutted with arrogance now looked small, like a child realizing for the first time that the world was bigger than his ego. His chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, and his eyes, once filled with pride, now flickered with something else, shame. For minutes, he sat frozen, the sound of the mop swishing across the mat mocking his silence. Every stroke was a reminder of the man he had underestimated, the man he had ridiculed, a man who could have destroyed him completely but had chosen restraint. That restraint cut deeper than any knockout. Finally, Derek pushed himself to his feet. His legs trembled, not from physical pain but from the weight of humility pressing down on him. He walked slowly toward James, each step echoing with the heaviness of his pride. The dojo watched in hushed anticipation, knowing this moment mattered more than any fight. James looked up from his work, calm as ever. His eyes met Derek's, steady and unflinching. For a heartbeat, Derek considered saying nothing, walking past him and clinging to the shreds of his pride. But he couldn't. Not anymore. I was wrong, Derek said, his voice raw, stripped of bravado. The words came slowly, as though dragged from the deepest part of him. I disrespected you. I mocked you. I thought I was better because of a belt around my waist, but tonight you showed me what real strength looks like. The dojo held its breath. Never before had Derek admitted weakness, not to anyone. I'm sorry, Derek continued, his voice cracking, for the way I treated you, for the way I spoke to you. You didn't deserve any of it. James studied him quietly, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he gave a small nod. Respect isn't something you get from belts or trophies, he said softly. It's something you earn by how you treat people, by the way you carry yourself when no one's watching. You understand that now. That's enough. Derek's eyes stung, though he fought to hide it. The words weren't scolding. They weren't cruel. They were simple truth, and they struck deeper than any punch James had thrown. Master Alvarez stepped forward then, his voice steady. Tonight, this dojo witnessed more than a sparring match. We witnessed a lesson. Pride blinds. Arrogance destroys. But humility is what makes a true martial artist. The students nodded in solemn agreement. Some of them felt ashamed for the times they had laughed at James, dismissing him as nothing more than a janitor. Others felt inspired, their view of martial arts transformed by the quiet man who had revealed himself as a living legend. From that night on, the dojo was never the same. James continued his work, mop in hand, uniform unchanged. But now, whenever he walked through the doors, the students greeted him with bowed heads and genuine respect. Some even approached him for advice, tentative at first, but soon with eagerness. And while James never advertised himself as a teacher, he didn't turn them away. A subtle adjustment of a stance here, a word of encouragement there. His lessons were quiet but profound. Derek, more than anyone, changed. Gone was the swagger, the arrogance, the need to dominate every space. He trained harder, but with a different purpose, not to show off, not to humiliate, but to grow. Slowly, he began to rebuild his reputation, not as the loudest fighter in the room, but as one of the most disciplined. And though he would never forget the sting of his defeat, he carried it not as a wound, but as a reminder. One evening, weeks later, Derek stayed behind after training. The dojo was empty except for James, who was sweeping the corner. Derek approached him quietly, carrying his gloves. "Would you train me?" Derek asked hesitantly. His voice no longer carried arrogance, only sincerity. James looked at him for a long moment, then gave a faint smile. "I'll show you what I can," he said. "But the rest? That's on you." And so began an unlikely mentorship. James never stepped fully into the spotlight again, never reclaimed the name Silent Storm with the world. But in that dojo, among those who had seen him for who he truly was, he became something greater than a fighter. He became a guide. A quiet force shaping not just punches and kicks, but character, humility, and respect. The legend of Silent Storm lived on, not in arenas or headlines, but in the hearts of those he touched. And for Derek, the lesson of that night never faded. Strength without humility was nothing. True greatness was silent, steady, and kind. At the end of the day, James proved something far greater than strength. He showed that true power isn't about titles, trophies, or belts. It's about humility, discipline, and the way you treat others. Derek walked in seeking to humiliate a janitor, but he walked out having met a legend, and more importantly, learning the value of respect. Sometimes the strongest people are the quiet ones standing in the background, carrying battles you know nothing about. And if this story inspired you, remind yourself, greatness doesn't need to be loud. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who could use this reminder today.